Our cameras spotted a lot of what experts, detectives, and investigators walked the jury through today. These searches, when police uncovered a blood-stained board nowhere near the Stauch family home, they testified GPS tracking data from Letecia Stauch's phone led them to this rural area. And pictures from Al's phone, Gannon's dad, dating back to 2019, show a board just like this one that they found inside the house. A crime scene investigator and bloodstain expert talks about uncovering blood spatter evidence in Gannon's room, saying it took 1.5 hours to find because the room had been cleaned before their arrival.
Unfortunately, you left this world fighting. Your Honor, she fought against someone that he loved and trusted. Someone that myself and Albert both trusted and loved. Someone who can never understand what it means to love or trust anyone but herself.
When 11-year-old Gannon Stauch was reported missing, the story sounded simple. He had walked to a friend's house and never came back. But the first crack came from a neighbor's camera. It showed Gannon leaving home with his stepmother. And when the truck returned, he was nowhere to be seen. For weeks, his family searched, prayed, and hoped he was still alive. Then the truth surfaced more than 1,000 miles away, beneath a bridge in Florida, where investigators found a suitcase. Inside was the confirmation investigators and family members had feared, and the beginning of a case darker than anyone imagined. The discovery in Florida changed everything. Until that moment, there was still a painful space for hope, however small. Families of missing children often live inside that space, replaying every hour, every phone call, every possibility. Maybe he was hidden somewhere. Maybe someone had taken him. Maybe there was still time. But when investigators confirmed that the remains belonged to Gannon, hope became grief. The question was no longer where Gannon was. The question became what had happened to him and why the story told at the beginning did not match the evidence. Investigators began looking closely at the person who first reported him missing, his stepmother, Letecia Stauch. She had told authorities that Gannon left home to visit a friend, but surveillance video from a neighbor's camera appeared to show something different. It showed Gannon leaving the house with Letecia in a truck. Hours later, that same truck returned. Gannon was not seen getting out. That detail was small at first, just a piece of video from a quiet neighborhood street. But in this case, it became one of the first cracks in the story. As detectives continued building the timeline, the case moved away from the idea of a runaway child and towards something far darker. The focus shifted back to the home, back to the hours before the missing person call, and back to the person who had been with Gannon during the most important window of time. For Gannon's family, this was the cruelest turn. They had been searching outward, imagining danger somewhere beyond the house. But the evidence was beginning to suggest that the truth may have started inside the place where he should have been safest. As investigators looked deeper into the timeline, the story became harder to accept. Letecia Stauch's first explanation was simple. Gannon had left the house on foot to visit a friend, but the more detectives compared that claim against the evidence, the less it seemed to hold together. The neighbor's surveillance video became one of the most important early pieces. It did not show Gannon walking away alone in the afternoon, as Letecia had described. Instead, it appeared to show him leaving earlier that day with her in a truck. And when the vehicle returned, Gannon was not seen coming back inside. That was the point where the case began to shift. Investigators were no longer only asking where Gannon had gone. They were asking whether he had ever left the house in the way Letecia claimed. They began reconstructing the day hour by hour, looking at movements, phone activity, travel, statements, and anything that could explain the gap between the story and the evidence. And then the search moved beyond the neighborhood. Authorities began examining areas connected to Letecia's movements after Gannon disappeared. Search teams looked through difficult terrain, roadsides, and remote locations. Every possible clue mattered. Because by then, detectives believed the truth had not disappeared randomly. They believed someone had tried to move it, hide it, and bury it beneath confusion. For Gannon's family, those days were unbearable. They were still speaking publicly, still pleading for answers, still hoping that someone, somewhere, knew something that could bring him home. But behind the scenes, investigators were building a very different picture from the one the public first heard. Letecia's behavior also came under increasing scrutiny. Her statements changed, her explanations became more complicated, and each new version seemed to create more questions than answers. In an investigation, a changing story is not proof by itself. But when a changing story is placed beside video, forensic evidence, travel records, and missing time, it can become impossible to ignore. Piece by piece, the case was narrowing. What had started as a missing child report was becoming a homicide investigation centered on someone inside Gannon's own home. That is what made the case so devastating. The danger was not a stranger passing through the neighborhood. It was not a random abduction in the street. The evidence was pulling investigators back to the one place every child is supposed to be protected: home. As the investigation tightened, detectives began to focus not only on what Letecia Stauch said, but on what the physical evidence appeared to show. Inside the home, investigators found signs that Gannon's final hours may have unfolded far differently from the story first given to police. According to court documents and testimony later presented in the case, investigators discovered evidence of blood in areas connected to Gannon's bedroom. They also examined the basement, the bed, the carpet, and other parts of the room where they believed something violent may have happened. This was no longer a case built only on suspicion. It was becoming a case built on a room where a child had slept, a room inside his own house. A room that to investigators appeared to hold traces of what someone had tried to erase. Prosecutors would later argue that Gannon was killed in Colorado before his body was moved. They alleged that after the attack, Letecia attempted to clean the scene and create distance between herself and the evidence. The details were disturbing, but the pattern was clear. Investigators believed this was not a disappearance. They believed it was a cover-up, and that changed the entire emotional weight of the case. Because while the public was still seeing flyers, search posts, and pleas for information, detectives were following a trail that pointed back toward the person who had first asked everyone to look elsewhere. Letecia's statements became a central part of the investigation. Over time, authorities said her explanations changed, and with each version, the story became more difficult to reconcile with the evidence. She reportedly gave accounts involving different people, different events, and different possibilities, but the evidence did not move with those stories. It kept pointing in the same direction. That is often where a case begins to break open. Not when someone confesses, not when one single clue explains everything, but when every piece that is supposed to create doubt begins creating the same answer. The video, the timeline, the missing hours, the forensic evidence, the movements after Gannon disappeared. Separately, each detail raised questions. Together, they formed a picture investigators could no longer ignore. On March 2nd, 2020, Letecia Stauch was arrested in South Carolina. At that moment, Gannon still had not been found. His family still did not have the final answer they were desperate for. But authorities had reached a point where they believed they had enough evidence to charge her in connection with his death. For the family, the arrest brought no real peace. It was a development, not an ending. It answered one question while making the worst possibility feel even more real. Gannon was still missing, and somewhere between Colorado and the truth, there was still a child who had not been brought home. Then, weeks later, the case crossed one more devastating line. Investigators in Florida were alerted after remains were found at a recovery site in Florida. The location was far from Colorado, far from the neighborhood where Gannon had vanished, and far from the place where his family had first searched for him. Soon, the remains were identified as Gannon's. The search was over, but the grief was just beginning. When Gannon was found in Florida, the case changed from a desperate search into a desperate search into a devastating confirmation. For weeks, people had shared his photo, repeated his name, and held on to the possibility that he might still be alive somewhere. That possibility ended beneath a bridge, more than 1,000 miles from home. But finding Gannon did not mean the story was finished. In many ways, It meant investigators could finally begin answering the questions that had haunted the case from the start. How had he died? When had he died? And how had a child who disappeared from Colorado ended up in Florida? The discovery of his remains gave prosecutors something they had not had before: the final physical proof that Gannon had not simply vanished. Investigators concluded that Gannon had died as the result of a crime, and someone had gone to extraordinary lengths to move his body far away from the place where the crime began. According to the case later presented in court, Gannon's body had been placed inside a suitcase. That detail became one of the most haunting images of the entire case, not because it needed to be described in graphic detail, but because of what it meant. The evidence suggested someone had moved Gannon far from where the case began. That is the part of this case that is almost impossible to sit with, because every step after the killing required choices. Someone had to conceal what happened. Someone had to move the body. Someone had to create distance. Someone had to continue speaking while knowing the truth was already buried beneath every word. For investigators, the Florida discovery connected two sides of the case: the home where Gannon was last seen and the place where his remains were found. The geography was shocking, but the evidence was beginning to form one continuous line. Colorado was where the story started. Florida was where the cover-up ended. Letecia Stauch was already in custody by the time Gannon was found. She had been arrested in South Carolina on March 2nd, 2020, before investigators recovered his remains. That timing mattered. Authorities had moved against her even without the body, which showed how much weight they believed the evidence already carried. After Gannon was found, the charges against her became even more serious and detailed. Prosecutors alleged not only that she killed him, but that she tampered with his body and physical evidence afterward. The case was no longer only about what happened in one violent moment. It was about everything that followed. And what followed, according to prosecutors, was an attempt to rewrite reality. There was the claim that Gannon had walked away to visit a friend. There were the shifting explanations. There was the surveillance video that appeared to contradict the original story. There was the physical evidence inside the home. There was the long distance between Colorado and Florida. And there was the suitcase. Each piece carried its own weight, but together, they told a story far stronger than any single accusation. The investigation became a reconstruction of absence. Detectives had to rebuild the final known hours of a child who could no longer speak for himself. They had to follow movements, compare statements, test evidence, examine digital records, and decide which details were mistakes, which were lies, and which were attempts to hide the truth. In that kind of investigation, silence is not empty. Silence has shape. A missing child who does not appear on camera again. A room with evidence that should not be there. A story that changes when challenged. A body found in a place no one connected to the first report. Piece by piece, the silence around Gannon began to tell investigators what had happened. For his family, none of that brought comfort. Evidence can explain a crime, but it cannot undo it. A timeline can answer where someone was, but it cannot return a child to his room. A courtroom can speak in charges, counts, and verdicts, but grief does not speak that language. Gannon's family had already endured the public agony of searching. Now they had to endure something else. Learning how much of that search had been built on a false version of events. That is one of the deepest cruelties in this case. The people who loved Gannon were not only robbed of him, they were forced to spend weeks hoping, pleading, and searching while the truth moved further away from them, hidden behind statements that did not hold. And still, they kept saying his name. Because before Gannon became evidence, before he became a case number, before his life was discussed in court, he was a little boy. He had a family that loved him. He had people waiting for him. He had a future that should have continued far beyond 11 years. The discovery in Florida gave investigators confirmation. It gave prosecutors a stronger case. It gave the public the terrible answer they had feared. But for the people who loved Gannon, it gave them something much heavier. It gave them the truth. And the truth was that he was never coming home. After Gannon's remains were identified, the case moved into its next phase: prosecution. By then, the public had already watched the story transform. It began with a missing child report, It became a search. Then it became an arrest. And finally, after the discovery in Florida, it became a murder case with a body, a location, and a trail prosecutors believed they could explain. Letecia Stauch was charged with multiple crimes connected to Gannon's death, including first-degree murder, child abuse resulting in death, tampering with a deceased human body, and tampering with physical evidence. But the courtroom would not only be about whether Gannon was dead, or whether someone had tried to hide what happened. The central question became whether Letecia was legally responsible for his death. Her defense centered on mental illness. At trial, her attorneys argued that she was not guilty by reason of insanity. That meant the jury had to consider not only the evidence of what happened, but whether she was capable, under the law, of understanding her actions and knowing they were wrong at the time. It was a difficult defense to present in a case so emotionally charged. The facts were already painful. The images were already heavy. The idea that Gannon had been killed, moved, and found so far from home had left many people horrified. But the legal system does not decide guilt based on grief alone. It requires evidence. It requires standards. It requires a jury to separate outrage from legal responsibility. Prosecutors argued that Letecia's actions after Gannon's death showed awareness and intent. They pointed to the alleged cleanup, the changing stories, the movement of his body, and the attempt to create a false explanation for his disappearance. To them, those were not the actions of someone who did not understand reality. They were the actions of someone trying to escape accountability. The defense saw it differently. They argued that Letecia's mental state distorted her behavior, and that her actions should be understood through the lens of severe psychological illness. The trial became a battle between two interpretations of the same conduct. Was it evidence of insanity or evidence of concealment? For Gannon's family, the courtroom was another form of suffering. They had already lost him. They had already searched for him. They had already learned that he had been found in a suitcase at a recovery site in Florida. Now they had to sit through testimony, evidence, expert opinions, and legal arguments about the person accused of taking him from them. Trials can give answers, but they also force families to relive the worst moments in precise detail. In May 2023, the jury reached its verdict. Letecia Stauch was found guilty of murdering Gannon. She was convicted of first-degree murder and other related charges, including evidence tampering. The jury rejected the insanity defense. For many people watching, it seemed like the legal ending had finally arrived. Letecia was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. In court, Gannon's family spoke about the depth of their loss, the cruelty of what happened, and the future that had been stolen from him. The verdict did not bring Gannon back, but it did give his family a public acknowledgement of responsibility. Legally, it looked like closure. Emotionally, there could never be full closure, because no sentence can measure the value of an 11-year-old child's life. No courtroom can restore the birthdays he missed, the milestones he never reached, or the ordinary days his family should have had with him. Still, the verdict mattered. It mattered because the evidence had been heard. It mattered because the false story had been challenged. It mattered because, for a time, the legal system gave Gannon's family an answer they could stand on. But the story of this case would not end there. Years later, the conviction would face a new challenge on appeal, and what seemed finished in 2023 would become uncertain again. In 2023, it looked like the case had reached its legal ending. A jury had heard the evidence. They had heard the arguments about insanity. They had heard prosecutors describe the cleanup, the movements, the suitcase, the bridge, and the changing stories. And after all of it, they found Letecia Stauch guilty. She was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. For Gannon's family, that verdict mattered. It did not heal them. It did not return the child they loved, but it gave them something firm to hold after years of horror. A public finding that the person accused of killing Gannon was legally responsible. Then, in 2026, that certainty was shaken. On April 2nd, 2026, the Colorado Court of Appeals reversed Letecia Stauch's convictions and sent the case back for a new trial, The reason was not that the appellate court found her innocent. It was not that the evidence against her had disappeared. It was not that Gannon's death had become any less real. The issue was the jury. During jury selection, one of the jurors had a connection to the prosecution's office. According to the appellate ruling, the juror's son-in-law worked as a deputy district attorney in the same office involved in prosecuting the case. The defense had challenged that juror for cause, arguing he should not serve. But the trial court allowed him to remain. He later sat on the jury and deliberated. To many people outside the legal system, that may sound technical. It may feel small compared to the horror of the crime itself. But in a courtroom, the fairness of the jury is not a small detail. It is the foundation. The appellate court concluded that allowing a biased juror to deliberate created what the law calls structural error. That means the problem was not treated as a minor mistake that could be ignored if the evidence still seemed strong. It was a defect in the framework of the trial itself. The court ruled that because a biased juror participated in deliberations, the convictions had to be reversed. For Gannon's family, the ruling was devastating in a different way. They had already survived the disappearance. They had already survived the search. They had already learned that Gannon was found in Florida, far from home. They had already sat through a trial filled with evidence no family should ever have to hear. Now, after hearing the word guilty, they were being told the process might have to happen again. That is one of the hardest truths about criminal justice. A verdict can feel final, but the legal system still has rules it must follow. Those rules exist not only for defendants but for the integrity of every conviction. A case this serious cannot simply be emotionally satisfying. It has to be legally sound, and that is what makes this chapter so painful. Because two things can be true at the same time. The evidence presented at trial can be overwhelming to the people who heard it, and the trial process can still contain an error serious enough to require reversal. A family can deserve closure, and the law can still demand a new proceeding. A child can be gone forever, and the courtroom can still return to the beginning. After the appellate decision, prosecutors said they remained committed to seeking justice for Gannon. They could ask the Colorado Supreme Court to review the ruling, and if that did not restore the conviction, they could present the case again to a new jury. But for the people who loved Gannon, the possibility of a retrial meant reopening a wound that had never truly closed. They would have to hear the timeline again. They would have to hear about the room again. They would have to hear about the suitcase again. They would have to hear experts, lawyers, objections, arguments, and testimony again. And all of it would circle back to the same unbearable center. An 11-year-old boy who should still be alive. This is why the 2026 reversal does not erase the story. It complicates it. It reminds us that justice is not only about what happened. It is also about whether the system can prove what happened in a way that survives scrutiny. That standard can be frustrating, especially in a case that carries so much grief, but it is also what separates justice from revenge. For Gannon, the emotional truth of this case has never changed. He was a child. He was loved. He was reported missing from the place where he should have been protected. His body was later found far from home, and his family has had to carry the weight of each new development. Even when those developments reopen the pain, the legal story may continue. There may be another courtroom, another jury, another round of testimony. But beneath all of that, the heart of the case remains the same. Gannon Stauch was 11 years old, and no appeal, no ruling, and no retrial can change what was taken from him. The case of Gannon Stauch is painful for many reasons, but one of the hardest is this. It began with a story that sounded ordinary enough to believe. A child left home, a child went to see a friend, a child did not come back. Those first explanations matter. In the early hours of any missing child case, the story told at the beginning can shape where people search, how they search, and what they believe they are looking for. But the Gannon Stauch case reminds us that the first version is not always the true version. Evidence has to matter more than comfort, because comfort wanted this to be a runaway report. Comfort wanted this to be a runaway report. Comfort wanted Gannon to be somewhere nearby, scared but alive, waiting for someone to find him. But the evidence kept moving in another direction. It moved from a missing child report to surveillance footage, from surveillance footage to a broken timeline, from a broken timeline to physical evidence, from Colorado to Florida, from hope to confirmation. And at every step, the case became heavier. Gannon was not a symbol. He was not a plot point in a courtroom. He was an 11-year-old boy whose life should have continued. He should have had birthdays, school days, quiet evenings at home, ordinary arguments, favorite meals, new memories, and years that no one had the right to take from him. That is why the ending of this case cannot belong only to the defendant, the verdict, or the appeal. It has to come back to Gannon. Because in true crime, it is easy for attention to drift toward the person accused, their explanations, their behavior, their trial strategy, their sentence, their appeal. But the center of the story was never Letecia Stauch. The center was the child who did not come home. The lesson here is not paranoia. It is awareness. When a child disappears, every detail matters. The timeline matters. The last confirmed sighting matters. The person who gives the first account matters. The video that does not match the story matters. The room, the phone records, the movements, the inconsistencies, they all matter. And when something feels wrong, it should not be dismissed simply because the explanation comes from someone close. Sometimes danger wears the face of familiarity. Sometimes the person with access is also the person with control. And sometimes the place where a child should be safest becomes the place investigators have to examine most carefully. That is an unbearable truth. But it is an unbearable truth. But it is one this case forces us to face. Gannon's family had to endure more than one loss. They lost him first. Then they lost the hope that he might still be found alive. Then they had to sit through the details of what investigators believed happened to him. Then, even after a conviction, they had to watch the legal process become uncertain again. That kind of grief does not move in a straight line. It reopens, it returns, it waits in courtrooms, in headlines, in dates on a calendar, and in every birthday that never comes. For the public, this case may be remembered through certain images: the neighborhood camera, the search teams, the suitcase, the bridge, the courtroom. But for the people who loved Gannon, the memory is not evidence. It is personal. It is the sound of his voice, the shape of his smile, the empty space where his future should have been. And that is where this story should end. Not with legal language, not with the person accused, not with the cruelty of the crime, but with the boy who deserved more time. But with the boy who deserved more time. Gannon Stauch was 11 years old when he was reported missing from his home in Colorado. For weeks, people searched for him, hoped for him, prayed for him, and called his name into a world that already knew the answer was darker than anyone wanted to imagine. His body was eventually found far from home. But his story should never be reduced to where he was found. He was loved before he was lost. He mattered before he became a case. And even now, after the headlines, the testimony, the verdict, and the appeal, that is the truth that should remain. Gannon was not just a missing child. He was a son, a brother, a little boy with a life still ahead of him, and he should have come home. There is a strange cruelty in cases like this. For the public, the story eventually becomes a timeline: dates, charges, evidence, verdicts, appeals, a sequence of events that can be explained in order, placed into chapters, and followed from beginning to end. But for a family, there is no clean order to grief. There is before, and there is after. Before January 27th, 2020, Gannon Stauch was not a headline. He was not a courtroom exhibit. He was not a child whose final hours would one day be reconstructed by investigators, attorneys, experts, and jurors. He was simply Gannon. A boy who should have grown older. A boy who should have had ordinary days. A boy who should have had time to become whoever he was going to be. That is the part every legal document can describe around, but never truly capture. Court records can tell us what prosecutors alleged. They can tell us what the jury once decided. They can tell us why an appellate court later reversed the convictions and sent the case back. They can explain structural error, juror bias, and the rules that protect the fairness of a trial. Those rules matter. They matter because the justice system cannot survive on emotion alone. It has to survive scrutiny. It has to be fair even when the facts are unbearable. It has to follow procedure, even when people are exhausted by the process. But none of that makes the emotional cost disappear. For Gannon's family, every new legal development means the wound is touched again. Every headline brings his name back into public view. Every court date risks reopening what they have already had to survive. The missing report, the search, the discovery, the testimony, the verdict, and then the uncertainty that followed. People often talk about closure as if it is a final door that can be shut. But in cases like this, closure is more complicated. A verdict can bring accountability, but it cannot restore a child. A sentence can bring consequence, but it cannot return the years. An appeal can protect the process, but it can also force a family back into the same nightmare they thought they had already faced. That is why the story of Gannon Stauch should never be reduced to the legal twist at the end. The reversal matters. The retrial question matters. The justice process matters. But justice process matters. But Gannon matters more. The danger in true crime storytelling is that the person accused can begin to take over the entire narrative. Their behavior becomes the focus. Their defense becomes the focus. Their psychology, their lies, their trial, their sentence, their appeal piece by piece. The victim can be pushed to the edge of their own story. That cannot happen here. Because before anyone argued about evidence in court, Gannon was a child who was reported missing. Before anyone debated insanity, intent, or juror bias, people were searching for him. Before the world learned about the suitcase in Florida, there was a family hoping that somehow, against every dark possibility, he might still be found alive. That hope was taken from them. And that is the loss at the center of everything. The lesson of this case is not simply that evidence matters, though it does. It is not simply that timelines matter, though they do. It is not simply that the first story in a missing child case must be tested against facts, though it must. The deeper lesson is that truth has to be protected from every direction. It has to be protected from lies. It has to be protected from assumptions. It has to be protected from rushed conclusions. And it has to be protected inside the courtroom itself. Because if the process fails, even a conviction can become unstable. And when that happens, the people who suffer most are often the same people who have already lost the most. Gannon's family deserved a world where he came home that day. When that was no longer possible, they deserved answers. When answers came, they deserved a process strong enough to stand. And when that process was questioned, they were forced to carry the weight again. No family should have to become fluent in grief and procedure at the same time. But that is what this case demanded of them. So when we tell Gannon's story, the ending should not belong to the court alone. It should not belong to the person accused. It should not belong to the person accused. It should not belong to the appeal. It should return to the boy at the center. Gannon Stauch was 11 years old. He was loved, he was searched for, he was mourned. And even now, after every filing, every ruling, every argument, and every painful chapter, that is the truth that matters most. He should have had more time. He should have had more ordinary mornings. He should have had more ordinary mornings. He should have come home. There are some stories that do not end when the courtroom empties. The microphones are turned off. The cameras leave. The public moves on to the next case, the next headline, the next terrible thing, demanding attention. But for the family left behind, the story does not fade with the news cycle. It follows them into quiet rooms. It waits on holidays. It sits beside them on birthdays that should have been celebrated. For Gannon Stauch family, the pain was never just one moment. It was the day he was reported missing. It was the search that followed. It was the fear that grew heavier with every unanswered hour. It was the discovery in Florida. It was the trial. It was the verdict. And then, years later, it was the appeal that pulled the case back into uncertainty. That is what makes this case so difficult to close. Because on paper, the legal system can move backward. A conviction can be reversed. A trial can be ordered again. Lawyers can return to arguments that were already made. Evidence can be presented again, and a new jury can be asked to decide what another jury once decided before. But time does not reverse for the people who loved Gannon. They do not get to return to January 26, 2020. They do not get to wake up in a world where the missing report never happened. They do not get to search again with real hope. They do not get to undo the moment when hope became confirmation. The law can reopen a case. Grief was never closed. And that is the part of this story that should stay with us. Not the shock alone. Not the distance between Colorado and Florida. Not even the legal twist that changed the final chapter. Those details matter, but they are not the heart of the case. The heart of the case is an 11-year-old boy whose life was interrupted before it had even fully begun. Gannon should have been allowed to grow up. He should have been allowed to become a teenager, then an adult. He should have had ordinary problems, ordinary joys, ordinary days that no one outside his family would ever need to know about. He should have had a future too big to fit inside a court document. Instead, his name became attached to a timeline of evidence, a camera, a truck, a bedroom, a suitcase, a bridge, a verdict, an appeal. But none of those things are who he was. They are what happened after. And in true crime, that distinction matters. Because if we are not careful, the worst thing that happened to a person becomes the only thing people remember about them. The crime swallows the life. The accused becomes more discussed than the victim. The strategy becomes more memorable than the child. Gannon deserves better than that. His story should remind us that every missing child report must be treated with urgency, but also with discipline. The first explanation should be heard, but it must be tested. The person giving the timeline should be listened to, but not automatically believed. Searchers need hope, but investigators need evidence. And when those two things pull in different directions, evidence has to lead. That is not cynicism. That is how truth survives. This case also reminds us that justice is not only about reaching a verdict, it is about reaching a verdict that can stand. That can be painful to hear, especially when the evidence presented at trial is devastating. But a broken process can reopen even the strongest case, and when that happens, the family suffers again. So the lesson here is not simple. It is not just trust evidence. It is not just protect children. It is not just hold the guilty accountable. It is all of that, but it is also this. When a child is taken, every system that touches the case carries a responsibility. The family, the investigators, the prosecutors, the courts, the public telling the story later. Each one has to handle the truth carefully, because behind every filing, every ruling, every argument, and every headline, there is someone whose life was real before it became evidence. Gannon Stauch was real. He was loved. He was searched for. He was missed before the world even knew how much had already been lost. And no matter what happens next in court, that should remain the final image. Not the suitcase, not the bridge, not the defendant, Gannon. A little boy who should have come home. In the end, the story of Gannon Stauch leaves us with a kind of silence that is difficult to explain. It is not the silence of unanswered questions, because many parts of this case have been examined in painful detail. Investigators built timelines. Prosecutors presented evidence. A jury once reached a verdict. An appellate court later questioned the fairness of the process. The legal story became complicated, and it may continue through more hearings, more arguments, and possibly another trial. But beneath all of that, there is another silence. The silence of a room where a child should have been. The silence at a dinner table with one seat missing. The silence inside a family forced to learn how to live around an absence that never goes away. That is the silence no court can fully address. A courtroom can decide guilt. It can test evidence. It can correct errors. It can sentence, reverse, remand, and begin again. Those things matter, because justice without fairness is not justice at all. But a courtroom cannot give Gannon back the life he lost. It cannot give his family the ordinary future they were supposed to have with him. It cannot restore the days before the search, before the headlines, before strangers across the country knew his name, for the worst possible reason. And that is why stories like this must be handled carefully. Because true crime is not just about what happened. It is about what was taken. It is about the distance between the life someone had and the case file they became. It is about remembering that behind every piece of evidence, there was once a person who did not know their final day was coming. For Gannon, that person was an 11-year-old boy, not a symbol, not a legal argument, not a tragic image, a child. And when we say that, we should feel the weight of it. Children depend on the adults around them to tell the truth, to protect them, to notice when something is wrong, and to act when danger appears. In Gannon's case, the first story told to the world sent people searching outward. But the evidence eventually pulled the investigation back toward the place where he should have been safest. That is one of the hardest lessons here. Danger does not always arrive from outside. Sometimes it is already close. Sometimes it is protected by familiarity. Sometimes it hides behind a calm explanation, a changing story, or a version of events that sounds believable only because people want it to be true. That does not mean we live in fear of everyone around us. It means we pay attention. We pay attention to timelines that do not fit. We pay attention to children who are missing. We pay attention to evidence even when it leads somewhere painful. And we pay attention to the way the justice system handles the truth once it finally reaches court. Because in a case like this, every step matters. The search matters. The investigation matters. The trial matters. The appeal matters. And most of all, the child matters. Gannon's name should not be remembered only because of the cruelty connected to it. It should be remembered because he was loved, because people searched for him, because his life had value long before the world learned how it ended. No legal outcome can erase that. No appeal can change it. No future trial can make it less true. No headline can reduce him to the worst thing that happened. Gannon Stauch was here. He had a family. He had a future. He had a life that deserved to continue. And when we tell his story, the final responsibility is simple. Do not let the crime become bigger than the child. Remember Gannon first. Everything else comes after. When a case like Gannon Stauch's reaches the end of a documentary, there is a temptation to look for one final sentence that can make sense of everything. But some stories do not give us that. They do not offer comfort. They do not close neatly. They do not leave behind an answer strong enough to balance what was lost. Gannon was 11 years old. That fact alone should stop us. 11 is an age of school mornings, favorite things, small routines, and a future still forming. It is an age where a child should be protected by the adults around him, not remembered through court records, search efforts, and evidence photographs. And that is why his story stays with people. Not because of the person accused, not because of the legal drama, not because of the horror of where he was found, but because Gannon should still be here. He should have had more birthdays, more ordinary days, more chances to grow, change, laugh, argue, dream, and become his own person. His life should not have ended inside a story of suspicion, concealment, and grief. The legal process may continue. There may be more hearings, more filings, more testimony, and more pain for the people who loved him. But no matter what happens in court, the center of this case remains unchanged. A child was lost, a family was broken, and the truth, once uncovered, came too late to save him. So the final lesson is not complicated. When a child goes missing, every detail matters. The first story matters. The timeline matters. The inconsistencies matter. Evidence must be followed, even when it leads somewhere no one wants to look, because sometimes the truth is not far away. Sometimes it begins in the place that was supposed to be safest. Gannon's case reminds us to listen carefully, to question carefully, and to never let comfort replace facts. It reminds us that justice is not only about punishment, but about truth being handled with enough care to survive. Most of all, it reminds us that victims must remain at the center of their own stories. Gannon Stauch was not just a case. He was not just a headline. He was not just the child found far from home. He was a son, a brother, a little boy who was loved. And when everything else fades, the trial, the appeal, the arguments, the headlines, that is what should remain. Remember Gannon, not for how his life ended, but for the life he should have been allowed to live.